I think that as Joaquin was explaining, that there's a lot of duplication and of efforts and inefficiencies with our budgets when it comes to marketing and promotion. I don't think you can promote yourself into prosperity. I think it takes both promotional effort and it takes investment effort. I would like to see, a good 20 million of that dollars going directly into venture capital. Think what we could have accomplished if we had put $1 million into various enterprises each year over the last 20 years. There's no telling what we could have created. And so, yes, the promotion marketing is good, but I think it has to be leveraged with investment in the community, in the private sector, combined with the public sector. We need to think like Shark Tank. Okay, we need to be more entrepreneurial in our approach to business development.
And welcome back, Rio Grande Guardian viewers. I'm very pleased to say we've got another really interesting podcast coming up. I'm absolutely sure of it, because my special guest today is Bryan Cook, who is an industrial real estate developer and broker who deals primarily with Mexico. I thought it was important to bring him in because his knowledge of the history of the maquila industry, particularly in Reynosa, for me is fascinating. So welcome, Bryan.
Well, thank you, Steve. Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Like what you do and your coverage of the news here in the RGV, and particularly with the maquiladoras, has been very good. I think we met probably maybe 10 years ago at one of the charity events that the golf tournaments that we put together, started with Mike Myers, myself, and a few others, and that's been a good event.
Well, before we get, and the other thing we should tell the viewers, we'll also hopefully have time to talk about nearshoring.
Yes.
That current phenomenon. Right. We're going to talk about regionalism. Yes. We're going to talk about some of the challenges you see for our region, mm-hmm. and hopefully get into the subject of private equity, which you care a lot about.
Yeah, I think venture capital, private equity, improving the financial resources for the community is essential, no doubt about it.
Okay. Well, before we do any of that, I think we should hear your personal story. So tell us about your career here in the Valley.
I'm from the Rio Grande Valley, Edinburgh, graduated in 1983 from University of Texas Pan American. Originally it was Pan American University, and then they became part of the University of Texas. I moved up to Houston to engage in private equity and commercial real estate with a company up there for 2 years. But that was a tough call. Houston was going through some great pains at that time in the mid-'80s. The price of oil had collapsed. We had the savings and loan crisis. And I started reading more and more about the maquiladora industry here back along the border. And I thought, well, I speak Spanish. I can go down there. I can do that. I know real estate. I can stitch deals together just as good as anyone. I didn't have anything to lose. There wasn't much happening in Houston at the time, so I came back down actually on a very fortuitous moment. Went down to South Padre Island to visit some friends that were having a birthday there, and was at the yacht club, and met a gentleman who struck me as somewhat different. He was very fair complexion, white hair, but he spoke perfect Spanish, like lawyer-level Spanish. And I knew he was from Mexico City or from somewhere other than the Rio Grande Valley. And we got to talking, and he said, yeah, he was building a plant in Matamoros at the time for AT&T. I said, well, interesting. I'm interested in what's going on in the maquiladora, sector. And he said, well, that's good news. I need someone to keep an eye on things. I need to leave tomorrow, in fact, to go back to Kentucky and take care of his ailing mom. Could I go over and keep an eye on things in Matamoros? And I thought, well, sure, I can go do that. And so I did that for a few weeks while he was out of town, taking advantage of that opportunity. It was, he said, well, just make sure they're not stealing anything. Oh, and when the people from AT&T are there, make sure you show up on time. So that was my first intro, yeah.
Very fortuitous.
It was very fortuitous. And Ironically, he said he was leaving. He said, oh, by the way, Whirlpool is looking for a site. Go visit the people in McAllen. Go talk to Nancy Fryer. And I said, okay, I'll go do that. And I did, and I put the deal together with Whirlpool and Reynosa, and that was how things got started. This goes back 35 years. This is when MEDC was just being formed. They were an offshoot of the old Industrial Development Board, and I was reading where Larry Fallick and a couple of other business leaders, along with Tito Torres and Glenn Jarvis, to mention a few of these other really key leaders in the city of McAllen at the time, saw the need and formed the McAllen Economic Development Corporation. That's when they hired Mike Allen, a former Jesuit priest, who had a really strong conviction about what a community needed. And I'll never forget him telling me one day, he says, you know, you measure a community by how well it takes care of its least fortunate. And that was somewhat his mantra of his focus, and that was his foundation of how do you help a community. It wasn't about just putting numbers on the board. It was about how do you develop a community top to bottom. And so we saw that opportunity, and we get to the point of what I call value differentiators. What makes a community viable in the eyes of businesses? And businesses look at three fundamental components why they want to locate or relocate somewhere, and that's, are you going to save us some money? Are you going to make us some money? Or are you going to make our business model easier, less problematic, less friction? And so when you look at those three fundamentals, at the time, Reynosa was primarily undeveloped. It was rural.
So, yeah, I was going to ask you that because, like today, we've got, 130,000 workers or more in the maquila industry in Reynosa. What was it like when you first got there? How many workers?
It was a 2-lane road out to the industrial park that was half occupied with slow-moving vehicles, and the other half were trucks. But I was fortunate in that at the time, company by the name of Rio San Juan, and they're still in business, big company, headquartered out of Mexico City. They have a lot of land holdings on the border. I approached them and said, I think I can put this deal together with Whirlpool for you guys. They had just started their industrial park, and it was way on the way out of town, out near the Libramiento, which, as a crow flies, it was about a 20-mile hike from where my office was at the Vantage Bank building, which is now, and where MEDC first set up their offices, all the way to that park. And so it was primitive, and you know, the fundamentals were there in terms of talent and unemployed people, but there was a productivity factor, a 10-to-1, a cost factor, 10-to-1 ratio of hiring people in Reynosa versus these plants hiring people in the States. So there was a huge differentiator at that time. And I did some back-of-the-napkin math, and 1,000 employee operation would generate about $40 million in savings in the first year. So you didn't have to be a PhD in economics to figure that this was a huge opportunity.
Had NAFTA kicked in by then?
No, NAFTA was several years later. This was under the old Twin Plant Maquiladora program, or in bond program, where you could bring components and raw materials in bond or tax-free into these maquiladora plants, and they could transform those into finished goods or finished components and then export those back across into the U.S. and only pay a duty on the value-added component, which was the labor and other essential costs that were involved with the manufacturing of it.
So basically, you've seen Reynosa develop, the maquila industry develop. There was very little there when you started.
Yes, very little.
Could you ever imagined it would get this big?
You know, at the time I kept thinking, well, this is going to be a 3 or 5 year deal, and this is going to flare out, something's going to happen, and we'll see how it goes. So I just took it 1 year at a time. But when NAFTA kicked in, it changed a lot of the dynamics. It changed the dynamics because suddenly companies that hadn't considered Mexico because of certain laws. You could not owned property in Mexico, it had to be owned under a trusteeship, which is not difficult. It's just a lot of more legal work. But some companies were a bit averse to that, so they leased a lot of their properties. I did a lot of build-to-suits for leases at the time. But when NAFTA came in and it changed, it allowed Mexico to have a greater transparency in the business, and it allowed companies to come and set up in Mexico that they wouldn't be able to set up otherwise. That really accelerated the program. It really never changed what we call the maquila or the in-bond program for the maquilas. That has essentially stayed the same. But it really accelerated a lot of interest from other companies to come and set up. And, Del Norte Industrial Park was 250 acres at the time, and it had doubled by the time I left that organization. I think it was close to about 350 acres in size. They've since expanded across the street to Villa Florida and et cetera, et cetera.
Why do you think it was that Reynosa accelerated more than other Mexican cities along the border?
Oh, that's a good question. Juarez was really the centerpiece or the center of gravity for the maquila industry because of the infrastructure that was set up and their geographic location being in the middle, halfway to the West Coast and halfway to the East Coast. And it was a dry climate. It was not susceptible to hurricanes and other situations. What made Reynosa and McAllen successful was that McAllen is an attractive city, and they had good leadership in McAllen at the time. The board that was on the people on the board at MEDC at the time were just well-known individuals. Tito Torres his background was in finance for Citibank in New York City and Mexico City. So we had people like that could come in and speak to a CEO level of an audience with authenticity and with knowledge. And we just had a good group in McAllen that was just really very tight in terms of understanding what the mission was. And the mission is to take what opportunities that Reynosa had, in terms of its raw workforce and amplify them. Let's just amplify them. Let's do whatever it takes, to make these companies successful. And the focus was on the companies coming down. Whatever you need, we will find a way to get it. And I can remember getting involved in the weeds, as they say, with many of these projects. And Mexico, even though it's just right across the border, it's another planet. It's another culture. It's another way of doing business. So everything was, as I say, twice the effort, half the results. And so you really had to be on top of things. There was a lot of moving parts. Some of it was easy to get done. Some of it was more difficult.
Well, what do you say to the criticism that I've heard in Reynosa about the wage rates and maybe the working conditions in the early days, that the salary levels there, or wage levels there, were lower than the rest of the community, the rest of the Reynosa economy, and in fact, the workers were exploited?
I don't think exploitation, or they weren't really not exploited. I really never saw that. What I saw, however, was opportunities for people who really didn't have much opportunity at all in terms of finding any work in the Reynosa market. I mean, primarily Reynosa was dominated by Petros Mexicanos, Pemex, agriculture, and whatever trade that existed between the U.S. and Mexico. And that was primarily it. So anything outside that was very, very harsh conditions. What the maquilas did was offer them a safe environment, an air-conditioned building, a quality building, and it taught them some skill sets that they had before had not been taught. I mean, we're talking what what the U.S. operations brought in terms of technology, which is not just the machinery that these individuals learned to operate. It's not just a technology transfer. It was the methodology and the discipline of these organizations. Delco Electronics, I can remember running some quotations for them, and their playbook of specifications, looked like the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that was a discipline that was transferred over to the working population that they had not experienced before. And today, you can go to Reynosa, and they can produce economically and productivity levels of any plant in the entire world. I did a project recently for Kimball Electronics, and they have plants throughout the world, and they chose to expand in Reynosa with a large 270,000 square foot facility, specifically because it is one of the most productive environments of all their plants on their global footprint. And so the transfer of technology was unprecedented because you had never seen anything like that in Reynosa before. Unless you worked for Pemex, you really didn't have an opportunity to experience that. And yes, some of the first jobs were very hands-on, wire harnesses, subcomponents, electronic components. But for example, Delco Electronics had injection molding machines. They had wave soldering. They had some of the most sophisticated machinery that you've ever seen. And the same as this most recent project. They have some of the most sophisticated manufacturing machinery that you'll see anywhere, south of San Antonio. It's probably even more than what you see in some other states. Yeah.
So a few years back, probably 10 or more years ago, I remember there was a report out by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas that said that McAllen benefits from the maquila industry more than any other U.S. city on the border.
Oh, that's interesting.
I was wondering if you were aware of that. For some reason, with the engineers and the managers of the plants living on the McAllen side, the McAllen economy benefited from maquilas more than any other city.
Oh, in the early stages, most definitely. For example, Delco, when they came down, I think they had maybe 2,500 employees on the Mexican side, but there were a good 300 to 400 U.S. employees that were employed in that operation in both facilities. So they had a big contingent of people from the U.S. coming down. Over time, that has lessened because you have the transfer of technology and transfer of managerial job skills that the local population has increased their job proficiency and their executive management skills because of that transfer, not just of technology, but the transfer of business modeling or how we do things are this way. They were beneficiaries of the corporate playbook of how you operate a business. And to this day, again, they're very disciplined, hardest working people, very disciplined people.
So before we leave this topic of the maquilas,
yes,
tell us of all the projects you've worked on over there. What are you most proud of?
Well, they're all good, and they range in every scope from just doing simple expansions to complex build-to-suits. I remember in doing the Whirlpool project, it was kind of interesting because we were just at the former Embassy Suites just a few minutes ago, and I was commenting to Ron Whitlock. I said, the Embassy, this used to be the Embassy Suites. MEDC's offices were right across the street, and that was the nucleus for a lot of this new development. And I closed quite a few deals, made a lot of pitches right there at the Embassy Suites, and my memory was jogged about being there again today. But that's, I think, you always remember your first, and the Whirlpool was a good deal. I was able to leverage that deal because the gentleman I was working for out of Mexico City had the steel structure for a 35,000 square foot building that no one else had. And so I was able to leverage that into that deal. That deal was created by thin air. I had no idea what I was doing other than I was just focused on getting these people in a building. And it worked out well because they were about to sign a lease on an older building in an older part of town, and we were proposing them a new building in the new industrial park there, Del Norte. So MEDC people were happy to see a new building in a new park. Whirlpool people were happy. We were happy. That was one of those deals where everybody, it checked all the boxes, you know. So and they expanded 3 times after that. So yeah, they're all, you know, they're all good. I have great memories of doing good deals. Yes.
And I guess a shout out to the McAllen EDC and the McAllen Ford Trade Zone for their work and their vision in the early days.
Oh, absolutely. You know, Mike Allen had a good team with Keith and Nancy and others, and they all worked very well together, and they had a good vision, and we were very close. It's gotten so big now that we don't have that communication. I'd like to see a little tighter communication with them, you know, but it's a big industry. But yes, they were the catalyst for much of the success of the maquila industry, because companies could come down and they would see McAllen and they would see that as an attractive city. It wasn't right on the border like some of the other border cities. And then they would go and look at Reynosa and see just, you know, untold opportunity. So that's why the two worked very well.
Yeah, they did. Well, let's fast forward.
Sure.
We'll come up straight up to date. The big the buzzword right now is nearshoring. Mm-hmm. Your analysis of that, is that there to stay? Is that are we going to benefit from that? I know Nuevo Leon is benefiting more than Tamaulipas these days, but your thoughts?
There is huge interest in Nuevo Leon. They really have a good program, no doubt about it. Excuse me. I'm not sure why some of the companies are not looking at Reynosa and the McAllen Industrial Complex. I call it, it's one and the same, the Reynosa McAllen Industrial Corridor Complex Market. I'm not sure what is the reason why we haven't been receiving what I would have considered a greater share of that business. I don't know if it's because many of these new companies are new to the area. And so when you fly into Monterrey and you see the modern city that Monterrey is, and you meet the governor himself, and you meet the director of economic development for the state, and they have a staff of people, and they have the American Chamber of Commerce there, and they have an infrastructure, they have an education system, they have technology. And so for new companies wanting to set up operations, and you find yourself in that mix of like-minded, you know, familiar faces, as they say, in that environment, it's a tough deal to beat. You know, it's a tough deal to beat. Nuevo Leon really has their act together, and they're doing well at it. Yeah.
But in general, the nearshoring, with the businesses coming over from the Far East, they're planting themselves across Mexico or certain pockets of Mexico, and that trade or the truck movements are going to come through South Texas. We're going to be the beneficiary, whether it's Nuevo Leon or Tamaulipas.
I think some of that will occur, yes. Mm-hmm.
And so your thoughts on that phenomenon overall?
In the general scheme of things, I think nearshoring has several more years of interest and growth. I think that the idea of regionalism is probably going to continue to be favorable tailwinds for the RGV community. I like what I see in terms of more companies wanting to set up operations in the United States, and that creates especially the semiconductor business, because semiconductors are just the fundamentals of manufacturing these days. Everything has a semiconductor, a chip in it. And so when you see that playing out in the United States, to me, that lends itself more for some of that spillover business to continue on into Mexico and in the Rio Grande Valley to some degree.
So even so then, strategically, geographically, we're very well situated.
I think geographically we're well situated. I think the challenges that face the RGV is the lack of investment capital, venture capital, and startup capital. We're behind the curve by about 20 years compared to other communities, and I know we wanted to address that, and
let's do it now.
Dovetail into that.
Yep.
Or segue into that. I think that is probably, other than our water resource challenge, which is a concern, we have one region, one river. We need to look at what we can do to either improve our efficiencies of water consumption, look for alternative sources of water, drilling water wells. Before the canals were built in the 1920s, which put the Rio Grande Valley on the map, was our canal system connected to the Rio Grande River back in the 1920s. That's why they call it the Magic Valley. You just pour water on a seed in this fertile soil and it will grow. But we have challenges there with our water resources, and Jim Darling brought that to our attention in a few other conversations. But in the economic front, my concern is that we're trying to look at everything from the top-down type of approach, where promotion and attracting companies is the only means by which we can achieve or improve our well-being, our economic well-being, wealth growth in the community. And I think that's fine. That's good for companies that want to promote and they want to market the area. I like what Joaquin Spammer is doing by bringing a lot of the interested parties together and focusing on a regional approach. McAllen and Reynosa have always been very well connected in terms of their promotional efforts. But I think what we really need to look at in the RGV is we need to put millions and millions of dollars into startup and venture capital to grow from the bottom up. It's not just a top-down economy. We need to grow organically. And not only does that help the economic development horizontally in terms of feeding those startup companies, and I realize 8 out of 10 of those companies are not going to survive after the third year. Okay, those are the statistics. But you have to start somewhere, and you have to start developing that economic eco base so that you will learn from what works, what doesn't work. And when you look at what's made Silicon Valley so prosperous, it wasn't just the fact that it had a nice climate and a lot of smart people, is that they had access to venture capital. They had companies, individuals, wealthy individuals willing to place a bet on XYZ to become successful. And let's think about it. Google, Apple, HP, Microsoft, Amazon, Dell, all were startup companies. These were not legacy companies. And you see that happening in Austin. And so I think we really, really need to take a 180-degree look at if we want to achieve some level of wealth creation, not just job creation. If job creation was the source of wealth creation, all we would need is retail jobs. And we've realized that that's not the case. But you have to look at wealth creation. Wealth creation comes essentially from the bottom up. It comes from entrepreneurial activity. And I study a lot of these economies, and I travel quite a bit, and I spend a decent amount of time in Austin and New York City. And what I'm seeing, strangely enough, oddly enough, I should say, in New York City is a growing sub-market of tech, entrepreneurial tech activity that you would not have thought that would have been the center of tech activity. But what you have is a community of young people that want to live in that community. They're like-minded people. They're willing to sacrifice some of the comforts of an easy life other places. New York City is not an easy environment to live in when you're young. Okay, it's a struggle. But that they have access to venture capital. They have access to capital. And we're starving our local entrepreneurs by not providing, and the banks don't provide capital. This is not venture capital. This money, you're going to lose money on your placing your bets, okay? But 2 out of the 10 are going to do well. And out of those 8 that didn't survive, we're going to learn a lot about what works, what doesn't work.
Do you see any signs of that happening, that interest Any shoots started to emerge? I know Brownsville's trying hard to develop
Yes, I see some efforts in Brownsville with what they call the
E-Bridge Center.
Right, E-Bridge Center. And I understand that was they had a very good response to that. I think you need to amplify that. That is good for conversations. It's good for discussions. But you need the capital. You need the money. The money needs to come in large amounts. And the cities need to rethink. And the reason I say cities and communities need to rethink, because we're not going to have the private sector come in on its own and put money into these newfound communities, into these newfound businesses, okay? So we're going to need some public and private cooperation. The city of McAllen has $44 million in its discretionary fund that it generates, I believe, from the half-cent sales tax. That's a lot of money. And so when you see what cities have that they have access to, they're going to have to be willing to invest in local entrepreneurs. Not just simply invest in the education of these entrepreneurs, because we have a good education system, right? Especially with RGV and the medical school that they're developing. We have a very good infrastructure from our educational base. But what we're starving from is a lack of capital, investment capital. And it's going to really take that in order for the RGV to catch up.
In Brownsville's case, they've got a tie-up with a venture capital firm out of San Antonio.
San Antonio, right.
Yeah.
I saw that.
So, but you'd like to see this happening across the valley.
Absolutely. And that needs to be amped up. It's not just one $50,000 contribution. We need $50,000 contributions each and every year. It takes an enormous amount of money. And I don't know if the Valley community understands that. I don't think a lot of them see how other communities like New York City are thriving in their entrepreneurial activities. They really need to take a look at that. And like City of Boston. The City of Boston, they don't need capital from the public sector. They have a vibrant private capital sector. We don't have a vibrant private capital sector here for startups and venture capital.
And the old saying, what you've never had, you don't miss. That's perhaps why the Valley isn't focusing on this, that sector.
Right. We're transitioning from an agrarian economy that really just 50 years ago, we had a large agrarian economy. And we're transforming out of that into trying to become a manufacturing community. But manufacturing here on this side of the border, when companies come this far south and they look at what they can save and operate efficiencies by going just across the river, it's not a difficult choice just to go ahead and set up across the river. If you have more than 50 employees, unless you're doing something specific with robotics or something that is super high tech, your competitiveness is across the border. And so in terms of manufacturing, we have that good and that bad here along the Rio Grande River on the U.S. side. So we really need to think about how can we pivot from that in terms of just looking at manufacturing. And there's some good products that can be manufactured. I'm not just, discounting that opportunity. But I think we need to ask ourselves, where do we see ourselves 20 years from now? Where do we see ourselves 10 years from now? I think we have 20 years we have to have playing catch-up.
Do you happen to know a guy called Mike Brown, a scientist down here?
No.
Well, everything you've been saying here is exactly what we heard at the so-called Rioplex meeting just the other day.
Interesting.
Yes, Mario Reyna brought him in, and he was very specific about what industries we should be going after, the high-tech industries. And, so the component that wasn't discussed there was the venture capital. But in terms of the high-tech industries that we could
yes.
could and should be going after, that was discussed at the CEO group meeting or the Rioplex meeting. So there are people talking about this.
I think it needs to be discussed. I think action needs to take place. Interesting, the foreign trade zone in McAllen was the beneficiary of startup capital. It was a group of individuals who all put in $10,000. I don't remember if it was 50 or 60. That all put in, I believe, $10,000 apiece and said, well, we need a foreign trade zone. We have a bridge. We have Mexico. We need a foreign trade zone. And so you see that's where private capital came in early on. And they've benefited significantly from that. And so that needs to be applied to the tech sector. The same principles. We need investment capital.
And so we've done it before. The McAllen leadership did it all those years ago.
Thank you.
And so it can be done again.
Oh, I think so.
My last topic, regionalism. I know you spoke a little bit about it with the efforts now of the CEO group coming up with that new brand name of Rioplex. But your thoughts in general about the importance of us working regionally?
Oh, definitely. I think that as Joaquin was explaining, that there's a lot of duplication and of efforts and inefficiencies with our budgets when it comes to marketing and promotion. I think there was a figure of $115 million that was spent on marketing and promotion amongst the Rio Grande Valley cities.
Well, that's how much they've got in their budgets. They don't all spend it. Some of them just let it accrue interest and they never use it. Apparently,
I think that's fine. However, at the same time, I don't think you can promote yourself into prosperity. I think it takes both promotional effort and it takes investment effort. I would like to see, a good $20 million of that dollars going directly into venture capital. Some of these organizations have had $1 million annual budgets for the last 20 years. Think what we could have accomplished if we had put $1 million into various enterprises each year over the last 20 years. There's no telling what we could have created. And so, yes, the promotion marketing is good, but I think it has to be leveraged with investment in the community, in the private sector, combined with the public sector. We need to think like Shark Tank. Okay, we need to be more entrepreneurial in our approach to business development. We need to think about, and I know UTRGV has some good programs, but I'm hesitant to get too involved with the UTRGV programs because they're very institutional. Okay, they have a very set of standards that can somewhat bureaucratize a process. We need to just look and find companies that want to do things, give them equity, not loans. Loans are just a burden on many of these enterprises, but invest equity in their business and see what happens. Well, we have nothing to lose here in the RGV. Okay, we're again, I think we're 20 years behind the curve on much of this. But getting back to the question of regionalism, I think regionalism is good in terms of the promotional effort. I think it's a good way to differentiate individual cities as opposed to the RGV. And again, this is not necessarily anything that was new. The RGV has always promoted itself as the RGV, the Rio Grande Valley, in its early days promoting the citrus and vegetable, businesses that flourished in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s. But in terms of the cooperation, that will be left to be seen. It will be left to be seen as to who wants to cooperate, how that money is used, if there's money that's cooperatively used with the CEO group. Do they want to go and promote the area on their own? Do they want to utilize public funds for it? Those are some questions that don't have answers yet.
Well, Bryan, those are all the questions I had. So I really appreciate you coming in and giving us your analysis of it all. Is there anything else you want to add? Any topics we haven't covered that you want to talk about?
No, I think we covered most of what I could think of in a few minutes. I mean, I'll be glad to talk on and on, but I think there's some good opportunities here in the Rio Grande Valley. We do have some headwinds, and again, capital, venture capital, startup capital, I think is really important. I think for the CEOs working together, I would like to see some organization come to the forefront and say, okay, let's pool some of this money from the private sector, let's pool money from the public sector. If we want to do it on a regional basis, the entire Rio Grande Valley, and let's see what happens. Let's invest in some of these younger, smarter people than, our generation currently has, right?
Bryan, thank you so much for today's interview.
No, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for inviting me. Always good to see you. We'll see you out on the golf course again.
You got it.
Thank you.